A RAV4, a CR-V, and a CX-5 sitting in the same driveway at 10 years old and 150,000 miles will all still be worth keeping, but the bills that got them there are nowhere near the same size. And by the end of this, you'll know which of the three genuinely survives a decade, which one survives it cheapest, and which one hands you a 5-figure decision somewhere around year 8. That's the whole deal. Not a spec sheet, not a road test. What breaks, when, what it costs, and what the company that built it will actually do about it once the paper runs out. Here's the number that started this for me. One of the big used listing outfits runs a study every year on the odds of a given model reaching 250,000 miles. In the year they published it with the average car sitting at 8.6%, the RAV4 came in at 9.6, barely above the average car, well under the Toyota brand figure of around 17%. The 4Runner, the Sequoia, the Tacoma, those carry the reputation. The RAV4 borrows it. I'll be straight about that data before we lean on it, because that same study has been published with the industry average listed at 4.8% in one year and 8.6% in another, depending on how they crunched it and which fleet went into the pot. I'm taking the more conservative reading, which is the one that flatters the RAV4 least. The point isn't the decimal. The point is that the compact crossover badge on the tailgate does not inherit the truck's odometer. I've had all three of these families on stands, and the thing that decides 10 years is never the part people argue about online. It isn't horsepower, and it isn't which cabin feels nicer at the dealership. It's 4 assemblies and 1 decision. Stay with me on the transmission section in particular, because there is one powertrain among these three with no belt, no clutch pack, and effectively no friction wear item in the drive path at all. And it's not the one most people would guess. There's also an engine in this comparison, where the manufacturer quietly stretched coverage on one specific repair out to 10 years and 120,000 miles. Companies don't do that for fun. We'll get to both. And the villain seed, so you know where this is going. Every one of these three manufacturers knew about a hardware fault in these vehicles, put it in writing to their own dealers, and then offered you something that wasn't hardware. Start with what actually ends a car at year 10, because the industry has trained you to measure the wrong thing. Every reliability score you've ever seen is built on the first 3 years, or on annual survey responses that thin out badly past 100,000 miles. 3-year initial quality is a measurement of rattles, software glitches, and infotainment complaints. It is a genuinely useful number if you lease. It tells you almost nothing about whether a cylinder head cracks at 80,000. Think of it like judging 3 roofs by how many shingles blew off in the first 2 winters. That's real information. It just isn't the information you want when you're deciding which one you'll still be standing under in 2036. Nobody publishes clean 10-year model-level failure data. That's not me dodging. It genuinely doesn't exist in public. Manufacturers have it, warranty claim by warranty claim, and they don't share it. So what we've got instead is a triangulation: recall filings, technical service bulletins, warranty extensions, class action complaints, and the repair costs the aggregators publish. That's a real evidence base, because a bulletin is a company admitting in writing to its own dealers that something is failing in a pattern. That's the frame for everything that follows. Cars in this class die from a short list: a transmission or a hybrid drive unit, an engine that loses its head gasket seal, its coolant jacket, or its bearings, a high-voltage battery, rust in the rockers and subframe if you live where they salt. And then the 5th one, which is the actual killer. The owner decides that a $4,000 repair on a car worth $9,000 doesn't make sense, and a mechanically sound vehicle goes to auction. 10-year survival is arithmetic between repair cost and residual value, not a moral quality that Japanese engineering either has or hasn't got. So let's take the assemblies one at a time, in order of what they'll cost you. The transmission is where these three genuinely part company, and it's the least discussed difference between them. The gas CR-V uses a continuously variable transmission, a steel belt riding between two variable diameter pulleys, no fixed gears at all. Honda specifies its own fluid, HCF2, and the recommendation on these has run around 30,000 miles, with the rear differential on all-wheel drive versions on a similar clock using its own dual-pump fluid. Do that religiously, and these units go a long way. Skip it under stop-and-go duty, and you get shutter, then slip, and then a replacement quoted north of $4,000 on a vehicle whose powertrain warranty expired at 5 years or 60,000 miles. Now here's the part that matters more than the number. A CVT's belt and pulleys transmit torque through friction under enormous clamping pressure, and the fluid is not a lubricant in the ordinary sense. It's a load-carrying component. Its friction characteristics are engineered. When it degrades, it doesn't just get dirty. It stops gripping correctly, and the surfaces polish and glaze. By the way, if you drive a Toyota and want to keep it running for hundreds of thousands of miles, what you do before something breaks matters far more than most owners realize. That's why I put together the 500K Mile Car Care Bible. It covers 101 habits that can help your Toyota last longer, the warning signs you should never ignore, and how to spot mechanic upsells that quietly drain your wallet. To get your copy, just scan the QR code on screen with your phone's camera, or grab it from the first pinned comment below. That's why the fluid interval on a CVT is not the same kind of suggestion it is on a conventional automatic. It's structural. The CX-5, right through the outgoing generation, went the other way and kept a conventional 6-speed torque converter automatic with a real planetary gear set. 6 speeds in 2026 sounds ancient, and on a highway fuel economy sheet it is. But this is the durability winner of the 3 transmissions by a comfortable margin. And it's the least glamorous piece of hardware here. It's a design Mazda has built and rebuilt for well over a decade. It locks the converter aggressively so it behaves like a manual, and the general trade guidance is fluid service somewhere in the 40 to 60,000 mile window. Boring, serviceable, cheap to fix. Which brings me to the flag I planted earlier. The RAV4 hybrid, and from 2026 the RAV4 is hybrid only, doesn't use a stepped automatic or a belt CVT. It uses a power split device, a single planetary gear set with 2 motor generators, and the ratio is varied electrically by controlling motor speeds. There is no torque converter, no clutch pack, no band, no belt, no shifting. Nothing engages and disengages. Toyota has been building that same architecture since the late 90s, and it is, in my honest assessment, the single most durable automatic transmission fitted to any mainstream vehicle sold today. Not because it's clever, because there's almost nothing in it to wear out. The gears are in constant mesh, the loads are shared, and the parts that could slip simply don't exist. That is a real 10-year advantage, and it deserves saying plainly, because it cuts against everything the skeptic in me usually says about complexity. This is a case where the more complicated sounding thing has fewer wear items than the simple sounding thing. The gas RAV4 was a different story. The 2019 redesign brought an 8-speed automatic, and the first year of it generated a pile of complaints about hesitation and lurching from a rolling stop. Toyota issued a bulletin titled around hesitation on acceleration from a slow or rolling stop. That's an actual document. not a forum rumor. Owners were told repeatedly that the behavior was normal. Some cars improved with reflashes. Some owners simply adapted their right foot. If you're shopping used, a first model year 2019 gas RAV4 is the one I'd be most careful with. And 2021 onward is where the complaint volume drops off. Engines. This is where the money is, and where all three of these companies have something in the file. The Honda 1.5-liter turbo is the one with the longest paper trail, and it's a fuel dilution problem. Direct injection sprays fuel straight into the cylinder at high pressure. On a short trip in cold weather, the engine never reaches full operating temperature. Some of that fuel doesn't burn. It runs past the rings and ends up in the crankcase. Every engine does this a little. This one did it enough that owners pulled dipsticks reading over the full mark and smelling like a gas pump. The consequence isn't the smell. Gasoline in oil destroys viscosity, and viscosity is the only thing holding a hydrodynamic film between your crank journals and your bearing shells. The complaint filed in federal court in Minnesota laid out exactly that chain. Thinned oil, premature wear, rod and main bearing contact, and in the worst cases, a failed engine. In May 2019, Honda extended the factory warranty on more than 1 million 2017 and 2018 CR-Vs and 2016 through 2018 Civics with that engine. A settlement got final approval in September 2020. Then, a second wave of litigation came in 2022, alleging the same defect in 2019 through 2023 CR-Vs, along with certain Civics and Accords. Mazda's file is a cylinder head file, and there are two separate items in it. First, the naturally aspirated 2.5 with cylinder deactivation, which arrived on the 2018 CX-5. 2 of the 4 cylinders shut down under light load to save around 1 mile per gallon. In 2019, Mazda recalled 2018 and 2019 CX-5s along with certain Mazda 3s and Mazda 6s. Campaign 19V497, Mazda's own number 3719F, and the filing to the regulator covered 304,882 vehicles in the U.S. The stated defect, control software for the hydraulic valve clearance adjuster could misbehave on the transition back to 4 cylinders, and an intake valve rocker arm could come out of position and contact internal engine parts. Worst case in Mazda's own notice was loss of power or a stall with no restart. Then there's a service alert from 2020 that I find more telling than the recall. Mazda established a new service cylinder head assembly for that engine, and at one point instructed dealers to call the hotline for repair guidance because of a supply problem with cylinder heads, gasket sets, and partial engines. The searchable keywords on that bulletin include warped head, burnt valves, low compression, coolant leak, and rocker arm. You don't run short of cylinder heads for an engine that isn't eating cylinder heads. Now, a caveat I want to be honest about. Whether cylinder deactivation itself caused those head failures is inference, not established fact. The theory you'll hear from technicians is thermal. 2 cylinders running while 2 sit cold creates uneven expansion across the head and block. That's plausible physics, and I lean toward it. It is not what Mazda's documents say, because Mazda's documents don't say why. Anyone telling you the mechanism with certainty is filling in a blank the manufacturer left empty. Second Mazda item, and this is the loop I flagged at the top. The 2.5 turbo, the one in the higher CX-5 trims, has a documented coolant leak at the cylinder head around the exhaust manifold. Mazda issued bulletins on it starting in October 2021 and revised them repeatedly, describing cracks at a stud bolt hole or out at the exhaust manifold flange. Coolant leaking there means overheating, and overheating a modern aluminum head means an engine. Class actions filed in 2024 covered 2019 and 2020 CX-5s along with certain CX-9s and Mazda 6s. And then, Mazda did the thing that tells you how serious it was. Under a customer service program, coverage for that specific repair was extended to 10 years or 120,000 miles from the original warranty start date. 10 years on one repair, on an engine whose standard powertrain coverage ran 5 years or 60,000 miles. That's a company looking at its own claim data and concluding this would surface long after you'd stopped being their problem. Toyota's 2.5 naturally aspirated 4 is the plainest engine in this comparison, and that's its whole argument. No turbo, no cylinder deactivation, and dual injection. Port injectors as well as direct ones. That second set matters more than it sounds. On a direct injection only engine, no fuel ever washes across the back of the intake valves, so oil vapor from the crankcase ventilation system bakes onto them as carbon. And by 100,000 miles, you may be paying somebody to walnut blast your intake ports. Toyota's port injectors spray the valve backs at low load and keep them reasonably clean. Both the Honda 1.5 turbo and the Mazda 2.5 are direct injection only. Budget for that job on those two. Don't on the Toyota. If you're still with me, and I know that was a heavy stretch, the payoff is coming because we've done the two expensive assemblies, and what's left is where the 10-year decision actually gets made. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing is the whole ask. Next up is the high voltage battery, and there's a $9,000 gap between how two of these three companies warrant the exact same class of part: hybrid battery. Toyota covers the pack on 2020 and newer hybrids for 10 years, or 150,000 miles from date of first use, up from the old 8 years and 100,000. Honda covers the CR-V hybrid pack at 8 years, or 100,000 miles, which is the federal floor for a propulsion battery, extending to 10 years and 150,000 in states that follow California's emissions rules. The CX-5 in its outgoing form has no hybrid option at all, so it has no battery risk and no battery coverage question. And it also gives up around 11 miles per gallon to an all-wheel drive RAV4 hybrid, which over a decade is real money in the other direction. Replacement cost is where I have to admit the numbers are soft. You'll see 3,000 quoted and you'll see 8,000 quoted, and a 4,000 plus figure is common for the Honda pack. That spread is too wide to be a fact. It reflects new versus remanufactured, dealer versus independent, and which modules actually failed. My read, and I'll mark it as a read. If you're buying a used hybrid out of warranty, budget the high end and be pleasantly surprised, because a diagnosis fee to find out one module is bad is cheap, and a surprise is not. One genuine safety line here, because it's the only truly dangerous system in this comparison. The orange cables are orange for a reason. That pack runs at a few hundred volts DC. It does not care that the key is off, and it will not let go of you the way household AC might. Service disconnect, gloves, and honestly, hand it over. Everything else on these three vehicles is a jack stands and patience job. That one isn't. Rust and the small stuff quickly, because it's short and it still matters. Mazda's carried a rust reputation for decades, and the modern ones are hugely better, but door frame and rocker corrosion reports still show up on CX-5s after 5 to 7 years in salt country. RAV4s of this generation generated a steady complaint stream about water intrusion at the roof rails and around headlight seals. Liftgate struts weaken on all three somewhere around 60 to 80,000 miles and cost a couple $100s to replace. Infotainment glitches on early CX-5s. None of this ends a car. All of it shows up in the same 3-year survey that people mistake for a durability score. Then, money, which is the part everybody skips and shouldn't. The repair cost aggregators put the RAV4's average annual repair and maintenance at $429 against $521 for compact SUVs generally and $652 across all vehicles. The CX-5 sits a little higher at $447, with the best reliability score of the three on that particular scale, and the CR-V comes in as the cheapest of the trio. Look at that spread, $18 a year between the Toyota and the Mazda. Anyone telling you one of these three is a money pit relative to the others is arguing about pocket change. 10-year projections put a RAV4 at roughly $6,000 in maintenance and repairs across the decade, about $260 in year one, then over $700 a year from year 6 onward. That curve is the real story of 10-year ownership. It isn't a cliff. It's a slow escalation as consumables that were designed for 100,000 miles start arriving one after another, and depreciation, which dwarfs all of it. The RAV4 loses around 25% of its value in 5 years, the CR-V around 28, and the CX-5 considerably more. One analysis of 2020 models had it above 40%, against an industry average close to 42%. At 10 years, the RAV4 is down a little over half. The exact percentages move around between data sets and model years, so hold them loosely, but the ranking has been stable for years. What that means practically is uncomfortable. The RAV4 costs the most to buy, costs the most used, and still costs you the least to own, because you get more of your money back. The CX-5 is the bargain on the used lot precisely because the market undervalues it, which, if you're the buyer rather than the seller, is the single best argument in its favor. Now, the part I actually wanted to talk about. All three of these companies knew, not suspected, knew in writing to their own dealers before most owners had any idea. And what each one handed you was not a fix. It was a patch price to the warranty period. Honda put it to dealerships in October 2018 that these engines may experience oil dilution and that it could raise the oil level and cause a misfire. That's their language, in a letter to their own network. The complaint that followed alleged that what owners were largely told to do was change their oil more often and drive the car longer, in warmer weather. Read that again. You bought a vehicle. The remedy offered for gasoline getting into your bearings was a suggestion about your commute and your climate. And when the settlement finally landed, out-of-pocket reimbursement for repair expenses was capped at $250, while the warranty extension it delivered had already existed for over a year. Mazda's remedy for a rocker arm that could come out of position and strike internal engine parts was a software reprogram. That is the correct fix for the cause, and I'll grant that without hesitation. But if your rocker arm had already made contact, the flash doesn't unmake it, and the bulletin trail on new service cylinder heads and short supply partial engines tells you plenty about how many had. Then, on the turbo's cracked head, coverage got stretched to 10 years and $120,000, but only for that specific repair, and only after the bulletins had been circulating for years. Toyota's version is the most elegant because they wrote the honest sentence down. On the hybrid tanks that wouldn't take more than 9 or 10 gallons of the advertised 14.5, Toyota's own communication said the interim option was a replacement tank, and that replacing it may mitigate the concern, although it may not prevent the condition from reoccurring. That's a manufacturer telling you, in advance, that the remedy might not work. And in the meantime, owners were being coached to keep feeding the nozzle 1/10 of a gallon at a time. Here's the arithmetic underneath all three. And it's not a conspiracy. It's a budget line. Powertrain coverage runs 5 years or 60,000 miles. These faults surface at 80. 100, 120. A software flash costs a manufacturer an hour of dealer labor. A revised oil change interval costs them nothing at all. You pay for those. A cylinder head costs them thousands, times 100,000 vehicles. So the remedy gets sized to the cheapest thing that gets the car past the coverage window. And the difference between that and an actual repair is a bill with your name on it, arriving in a year when nobody is legally obliged to care. You can't stop them doing that. You can absolutely stop them doing it to you, because the same documents that prove the pattern are public. Every bulletin, every recall, every warranty extension, filed with the federal safety regulator and searchable by your vehicle identification number in about 90 seconds. The information asymmetry that makes the patch work only works on people who don't check. Which brings me to what I actually think 10-year ownership is, and it isn't brand loyalty. It's a skill. The people I've known who ran cars to 300,000 miles weren't lucky, and they weren't buying magic badges. They were doing something much less romantic. They knew which 2 or 3 assemblies on their particular vehicle were going to decide the whole thing. They spent money early on those, and they ignored everything else. They serviced the transmission fluid ahead of the book. They fixed a coolant leak the week it appeared instead of topping it off for 8 months. They read the recall list once a year like a bank statement. That's a transferable skill. And it's the reason I'd rather hand you a method than a winner. Because the honest answer to which one lasts 10 years is the one whose specific weak points you knew about and got in front of. A well-kept CX-5 with a naturally aspirated engine will outlive a neglected RAV4 every day of the week. Judgment beats badges, and judgment is learnable. So here's the procedure. Run it on your own numbers rather than mine. First, identify the exact powertrain, not the model. Turbo or naturally aspirated, cylinder deactivation or not, hybrid or gas. On these 3 vehicles, that single distinction moves your risk more than the difference between the brands. Second, run the vehicle identification number through the federal recall lookup. And specifically ask the dealer whether any customer service program or warranty extension applies to it. That's a different list from recalls, and they will not volunteer it. The Mazda 10-year, 120,000-mile coolant leak coverage is exactly the kind of thing that exists and goes unclaimed. Third, price the 2 big-ticket assemblies for that exact unit before you buy transmission or hybrid drive and engine from an independent shop, not the dealer. You now have your worst case. Fourth, compare that worst case to what the vehicle will be worth in 3 years. If a single failure exceeds the residual value, you're not buying a 10-year car. You're renting one with a balloon payment of unknown date. That test is the whole decision, and it works on any vehicle in any segment. Forever. Fifth, once it's yours, transmission fluid ahead of schedule. Always the specified fluid. No exceptions and no universal blends. Oil on the short interval if you do short cold trips, especially with a direct injection turbo. Fix coolant losses immediately. Wash the underside in winter if they salt your roads. Do that, and the payoff isn't dramatic. It's a bill that never shows up. It's year 9, 140,000 miles. And the most exciting thing that happens to you is a set of tires and a battery. While somebody who bought the same vehicle in the same year is sitting in a service lounge being told the word remanufactured. Nothing happens. That's the entire prize. And it's a bigger one than people think. Now I want the odometer readings, because that's the data nobody publishes, and you're all sitting on it. If you've got a RAV4, a CR-V, or a CX-5 past 150,000 miles, tell me the mileage, the engine, and the single most expensive thing that has failed on it. With the number, not a general impression, the actual repair, and the actual invoice. And if you're somewhere they salt the roads hard, say where you are and how the rockers and subframe are holding up, because a decade in Arizona and a decade in Ohio are not the same decade, and the surveys average them together like they are. I read them all. It's the best part of doing this, and half of what I know about how these things fail long term, I learned from people typing it out in a comment box at 11 at night. If this was useful, the subscribe button is the whole favor I'll ask for. There's a thread here I didn't pull, and it's been bugging me for a while. I still can't get a straight answer on why the same basic aluminum head design cracks around the exhaust manifold on the turbo version and holds up fine on the naturally aspirated one. Everything I've read is somebody's theory, including mine. When I've got something solid, I'll bring it. Until then, check the fluid, check the recall list, and don't accept a software update for a metal problem.